So I always like to ask other professional authors, how do you write? Do you have a pattern, a system every day, or you just catch as catch can, or what's your
I
mode?
get up, I do my first thing in the morning stuff. I do my Wordle, a couple other rituals, and then I sit down. I try to when I'm in production mode, I try to avoid what I call flying monkeys, which are things that come out of nowhere and stress me out and distract me, like, oh my God, I have to pay my taxes or, you know, what have you. So if I can successfully avoid those, I sit down um, and I try to pick up where I left off the day before. I write with a fountain pen on paper. Um, I have a bunch of fountain pens, so I change each day from one pen to the next so I can see where the breaks are. Um, I try to stop kind of in mid paragraph or mid sentence even because it's easier than to get going the next day when I'm kind of right in the middle of something. Um, and usually I'll go for hour and a half, 2 hours, write a few pages, um, and and then when I stop, I typically will have some thoughts that'll continue kind of coming into my head for a few minutes afterwards. So I carry my phone around and I make little voice memos. Oh, here's an idea for a good line of dialogue or whatever. Um, and then I try to do something completely unrelated for the remainder of the day.
Oh, interesting. So paper pen, that is old school. Jared Diamond still writes like that, which I find interesting. He has a secretary at UCLA that transcribes it into typewritten pages for his publisher, because I don't think he even types. But why do you do it? Just to slow yourself down a little bit?
That's definitely part of it. I'm a very fast typist, so it's easy to just bash things out on a keyboard before you've really thought them through. And it doesn't really gain you anything meaningful because uh, in general, just producing tons of material isn't really the hard part. Um, so for me, it's better to go a little slower. Each sentence sort of sits up here in the buffer for a little bit longer, so I can kind of. It's easier to improve things up here than it is down there. Once it's been actually written out, and then it's actually faster to edit with pen and paper. It's faster to just draw cross out a line than it is to get the mouse and double click or whatever, drag and all that. So editing is fast, and then when I type the material um, into a computer, which I do myself, that's an opportunity to make another editing pass as I go. So by the time it gets typed into the machine, it's fairly close to the final published form.
Oh, nice. That's cool. All right. So I've never tried writing science fiction or any kind of fiction. Well, at least that I know of. Maybe some of my nonfiction, some fiction creeps in there. Who knows? But
Inadvertent, yeah.
inadvertently, yeah. So, when I want to master a topic, like in the moral arc, I had a chapter on nuclear weapons and mutual assured destruction and all that. So I read a dozen or so books to kind of wrap my head around the whole thing. And then when ideas started repeating themselves, I realized, or the same references over and over. I thought, okay, I pretty much have the big picture here. Do you do something like that when you take on, I don't know, like climate change or cryptocurrency or something? Do you first sit down and read a dozen books or so?
Yeah, typically, I mean, it depends on the nature of the project. So some of the books I've written are just more pure speculative fiction that aren't really grounded in any so researchable topic as such. Others are very research intensive, so If it's a historical book, for example, that demands a lot of research, then I'll kind of taper. I'll start at the beginning of the project. I'm spending 90% of my time reading and 10% writing. And then that changes. And as you say, you do get to a point where you kind of get the sense of, okay, I've seen this mentioned a few times. I already know this. So it gives you kind of a warm feeling that you've covered the bases reasonably well. You're not missing anything, huge. And so that's the point where I tend to taper off a little bit on research because there is a little bit of a hazard of over researching sometimes, and when you've done that, when you put the effort in to visit a location or to read a bunch of books about something, you sort of feel this sunk cost fallacy, like, well, I really need us to find a way to work that material in because, that plane ticket cost a lot of money, or, I spent a whole week reading that book. And that may not actually be to the benefit of the finished work. It may be better to just leave that stuff out. So I've had to develop a little bit of self-awareness around, when I'm kind of geeking out too much.
Yeah. And when you do speculative fiction or even non-science fiction going forward in the future, seems there's something of a counterfactual reasoning there and a what if, and change the conditionals to see what might happen. Almost like Einstein's thought experiments, Gedanken experiments, riding on a beam of light, falling in an elevator shaft. I mean, these are never going to happen in real life. So much of science is doing kind of like what you're doing. So how do you go about doing that?
The answer changes a little bit depending on whether we're talking about a historical book like Polostan or the Baroque cycle versus science fiction per se. So in science fiction per se, the important thing is to have it be internally consistent and believable. So there's a certain set of rules that you need to follow. And those rules can be very non-scientifically based. So, Star Trek, people are traveling faster than the speed of light all the time. Well, you can't actually do that. So on that level, it's totally non-scientific. However, once they've established certain rules of the game, you use the warp drive instead of the impulse drive when you want to go faster than the speed of light, and it uses dilithium, whatever. Then you have to follow those rules, or your readers sense that you're just being undisciplined and not being serious about it. So but my science fiction tends to be more in the kind of hard science fiction realm where, as much as possible, I'm trying to observe. I'm trying to have some knowledge of the actual physics entailed, and to kind of follow the constraints of that, which I did a lot of in Seven Eves. And then for historical fiction, my usual approach is to try to learn what really did happen as best I can from reading historical sources, and then create fictitious characters that interact with with real historical figures. So that gives me the leeway to tell the story I want to tell, and to develop these fictional characters in some level of detail without feeling like I'm kind of tampering with the the historical truth as we know it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And then how do you develop, or how do you think about plot development and character development? How many people are you going to give us to learn about, and how much information do we need to know about each one to care about them? Do you like outline it ahead of time? These are my main characters, and this is the arc of the narrative, and that sort of thing.
I tend not to. The it's good to have some sense of where it's going, but the an outline seems like something that you write on day one of a 2-year project,
Yeah.
and over the 2 years, you're probably going to come up with better ideas than you had on day one. And if you've created this outline in advance, it takes on a kind of undeserved permanence uh, that might cause you to reject better ideas that come along as you go. And a lot of those ideas are the ones that really stick. The ones that sort of come to you are the ones that really stick and end up being the ones that you're proud of. So, the classic example is that, some secondary character will enter the story to play some role, and they end up being more interesting than the main character. And when that kind of thing happens, you have to go with it. You have to just accept that this has happened, and uh, and and start following that character, or make them a more important character, even if that's not how you outlined it, a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a kind of an organic development to the process itself. Maybe you don't even know where you're going to go with this plot or this character until you actually start putting pen onto paper, literally here. And then all of a sudden something happens in your brain. And you go, oh, well, okay, let's see where this goes.
It's a little of both. You do have to have some discipline to follow a a path to the end. And at the same time, like I said, you have to recognize when the muse has downloaded something into your brain, and respect that.
Yeah, the muse coming into your brain from on high. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I
All
mean,
right.
I don't actually believe in muses, but I think that when the ancient Greeks wrote about muses, they were describing a thing that happens. That was their interpretation of certain brain processes that happen when creative people are creating. So it's a great shorthand.
Well, it does appear to be. I mean, the research on this, the neuroscience is interesting, where a lot of these creative ideas pop into your brain, like when you're out on a hike or in the shower, when you're not thinking about the problem, but the process is going on subliminally. It's
Yeah,
underneath, or subconsciously. I mean, it's being
and that
processed. You're just not aware of it.
and that's exactly why I make a practice of spending the rest of the day doing completely unrelated things.
Yeah. Okay, last question on kind of the meta part of all this is your propeller head family, and what led to your development to get into the sciences, and then history, and then science fiction and historical fiction and so on.
Yeah, well, my one of my grandfathers was a physicist. The other was a biochemist. They were both on faculty of universities. My dad was electrical engineering professor for 35 years at Iowa State. My mom was a chemist who worked in labs, and
Oh
I
wow.
grew up in Ames, Iowa, which is home of Iowa State University, which is a university that is it's literally called the Iowa State University of Science and Technology, and it was a minor outpost of the Manhattan Project. So and it's somewhat isolated, like a lot of these Midwest college towns. It's not glommed on to a big city. It's just sitting there. And so, it's this little island of where the the proportion of people with PhDs or who are working on PhDs is just absurdly higher than anything around it. And so that was, when I was growing up, the, my friends, the people in my Boy Scout troop and so on, were all tended to be kids of hard science PhDs. And when you're, wherever you grow up in the world, you sort of think that's normal until you move away, right? And so I wasn't aware, of what a unusual milieu that was until I went to other places. Um, so that's just kind of the air that I breathed when I was growing up. We did model rockets, and my dad assembled all of our household appliances from kits, and uh, we had all these. I mean, we had a. This is a slightly digressive story, but to give you an idea, we had uh, a thing in our Boy Scout troop where we had one of the dads was a plant sciences professor, and another of the dads was a ex Manhattan Project guy. And so the the first dad took some corn seeds that were basically all the same genetically and handed them off to the second dad, who took them down into the hot room several stories beneath the ground, with the big leaded glass wall and the manipulators where they would work with incredibly radioactive things. And these seeds were exposed to radioactive sources at different dosages and then lifted back out and then handed out to us at the next Boy Scout meeting. And so our job, was to plant these seeds, and then, there was a prize that was going to be handed out for the tallest, healthiest corn plant, and another prize for the most exotic mutation.
That's crazy.
Right. And so when you're doing that, when you're, 9-year-old kid, watering your mutant corn plant, you just think that's kind of a normal thing that, that Boy Scouts do. But then, a few years later, you look back on it and you're like, okay, I, came out of a really odd background in some ways.
Yeah, I'll say. You can imagine that conversations around the campfire. So, what's your dad's PhD in?
Yeah.
That's really funny. So, were there expectations that you'd go into one of the sciences, and were they supportive when you became a successful science fiction writer?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like there was pressure. I would say, expectations is probably a fair word. I mean, the academic world, the academic lifestyle was kind of the default thing that people had been doing in my family for a few generations. And, you know, uh, back then, it seemed like a pretty good gig. You have to put in your time, get your PhD, uh, and then it was fairly normal from there to move on to a tenure track job. And once you get tenure, that's you move to some university town and you live out your life. And it doesn't pay a lot of money, but in terms of benefits and quality of life, it's a good gig. So, of course, during my lifetime, that has changed a lot. So it's no longer as attractive a career path as it was, for my parents' generation, let's say. Um, but I sort of looked at that after college. I took some time off. I I did some writing. I'd written a novel during college. I wrote another one after I graduated, and I was kind of banging around. A little directionless, and I moved to from Ames to Iowa City, the other big college town in Iowa, and worked at a day job there and wrote a third book. And but at the same time as I was doing that, I was taking the can't remember the tests that are just like the SAT except for grad school.
Oh, GRE.
Yeah, yeah. So I was kind of prepping for that to be my next, path. But as it happened, I was able to sell that third book, and so at that point, the decision was kind of made that that I would pursue that for a while, and I think it was unexpected, but there was never any sense from my family that I heard of disappointment or what are you doing kind of thing. So there wasn't like pressure or weird family dynamics around it.
Yeah. But at some point, you could at least hold up your contract to your dad and go, "Look at this advance I got on my third book."
Well, that's the thing. I mean, to have gotten one contract under one's belt, even if it was a small amount of money and not a hugely successful book, is sort of evidence that that this isn't a complete pipe dream.
Yeah. Yeah. How lives turn out. Genes, environment, and luck is how I think about it. So obviously your parents are smart, and you can recall all the things they did environmentally, books in the home and this kind of stuff, your Boy Scout story. But of course, you're also inheriting from them their genetics for intelligence and creativity and whatever else that's harder to see. But then there's contingency, as I prefer to call it, than luck. But just you did this instead of that. You went left instead of right. You wrote this instead of writing that. And then
I got enormously lucky in selling the book. So there was an enormous element of luck there for sure. Yeah.
But I think much of life turns like that, particularly at points where you could go left or right. Things could, the garden of forking branches, as it's called. And, once you go down one path and then you've cut off the other pathway and you end up in a new future that you've carved out for yourself. Yeah, I still think it's a great gig. I mean, academia, they complain a lot, but, I remember when being in college thinking, wow, these professors, they get summers off. They have all this autonomy, 2 weeks for Christmas, semester break, Easter break. It's like, what a great job.
Can be, yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't know. I hear people now talking about the adjunct faculty life and,
that part's
going from one gig to another and never getting tenure.
Well, that's what the universities have discovered. They could save a lot of money that way. So you could hire, instead of paying a 50-year-old, $200,000 a year, you could hire 3 25-year-old new PhDs at $6,000 a course, I think it is now, which is just nothing. No health care and so on. And they've been able to get away with that. There's no unionization of adjunct professors. So,
right.
But yeah, that's that kind of happened with me with I was just on a typical track to be a professor, but I didn't have I wasn't on a tenure track. This was at Occidental College, and then they had like a financial crisis that I could see this wasn't going to turn into a tenure track. And we'd already started Skeptic magazine, and then my first book, Why People Believe Weird Things, did really well. So my agent got me an advance for the second book. And then Skeptic got a little bit bigger, and I was able to move it out of my garage into an actual office. I thought, you know what? I think I'll just make a go of it and just, put academia on the back burner for a while and see how it goes. And I really never looked back. I think it often turns out like that.
Yeah, and you don't. You can still interact with academia. It's not.
Yeah, of course I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just don't like committee meetings.
Yeah.
So us authors, I like you, I don't mind being alone and just in my head with my thoughts and just out, I think that's fine. All right. Before we get, there's so many of the big ideas you've covered that I want to cover, but let's make sure we cover for your publisher, the new book, Polostan. And it's the first in your Bomb Light series. So already I'm getting a hint that there's 2 or 3 more to come. How do you know? Did you already write them?
I don't exactly, but I have just like I was saying before, I have a general schema, in my head that's been there for quite a while because I actually started this project more than 10 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Um, and um, the uh, but again, the you have to keep it fluid because you don't know what's gonna what the muse is gonna supply along the way. So yeah, there's a general plan, but
Okay. And what's the rough plot outline here, and where is it going? What's the subjects?
well, um, this actually this all started, I think, 2013 when I I got a text message from Seamus Blackley, who I think
I do know
you're
Seamus. Yes.
yeah. So I've known him for a while, and he had gotten interested. I'll keep things vague, but he had gotten interested in the topic of certain developments that happened during the 1930s that were lesser known, let's say, lesser written about precursors to the development of the bomb. And um, so both he and I have been exchanging notes and kind of talking about that for a long time now. And the general theme is that the um, strangely, the neutron wasn't discovered until 1932. So, you know, there are probably people alive today, like really old people, but nonetheless alive, who, when they were in elementary school, were taught that there's electrons and protons and that's it. So the neutron, they figured out the neutron. I think that's Chadwick. Um, but a lot of people were on the scent of it. They just couldn't make sense of the data. Um, and when that gets figured out, it sets in motion a chain reaction, as it were, that leads eventually to nuclear physics and the bomb. Um, and so there's this ferment that I'm trying to capture in the early 30s, let's say 1932 to 1935, where um, it's they know something big is up. They know that that neutrons can cause transmutation of elements, that they can enter into the nucleus and change one nucleus into another, and that there are all these isotopes that can get generated that way and can be characterized, and they don't have um, they don't have particle accelerators yet, really. So, but what they can do is send balloons up to the outer reaches of the stratosphere and do experiments using cosmic rays. Um, and at first, they don't even know that they're cosmic, but if you go up high, you see more of them, and you see the same number of them even when the moon is in the way, like during a solar eclipse. So they must be coming from all over the universe, not from the sun. So there's this sense that something really fundamental, really important is happening, that there's huge new frontiers of science that are being opened up. And no one, of course, knows that that there's going to be a bomb, or that bombs and controlled or uncontrolled fission is going to be possible. But there's kind of this ferment, and only a few people in the world really understand it. Um, so there's kind of this small circle of people, Fermi's group in Italy and the Curies in Paris, Chadwick and Rutherford and so on, Millikan and Compton in the United States, and they're all kind of on the scent of this, and um, so I'm trying to capture some of that, but have it integrated with everything else that's happening in the world historically and politically during that era, which is the height of the Great Depression. It's the beginning of the essentially the Cold War between these different systems of how the world should work. You've got communism, you've got American capitalism, and you've got fascism. They're all vying with each other to show which is the superior system, which who's going to control the future. And of course, we know in retrospect that it leads eventually to the Second World War, which concludes with the atomic bomb. So this is the first. Polostan is the first volume in this series, and there will be others to follow. But it takes place in 1932, 1933, early 1934. And it introduces one of the main characters of the series, who's a young woman who is both American and Russian. Her American name is Dawn, and her Russian name is Aurora. And it kind of sets her up and tells her story.
Nice. Yeah. I presume the other volumes will go into the late 30s and early 40s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they'll focus on other characters, but the previous characters, will continue through into the subsequent books.
Yeah, nice touch. Half, part Russian, part American. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, just of the books I read on nuclear weapons, I think describing what you were just talking about, Richard Rhodes, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, is probably the best I read on that.
Yeah,
really, really nicely develops all that. Still, probably the best history of that around.
It's an amazing document.
Yeah, it's a great read. But I've been thinking about, so let's do one of your counterfactuals and talk about contingency. And I'll start with this, line: no Hitler, no Holocaust. Why? Because the Germans, while they were anti-Semitic, they were not exterminationist anti-Semitic. That was really the doing of one man and then his underlings who carried it out, his willing executioners, as they're called. But then you can go from there to say, no Hitler, no World War II. Even his own generals didn't think, as late as 1938 at Munich, there was that assassination plot to kill Hitler. Had the Allies not conceded at Munich to let Hitler take more land peacefully. And so they, without that, there probably wouldn't have been any reason to invade Poland and trigger the French and the British to declare war on Germany, and off we go. And then, so if none of that happens, there's no reason to develop atomic weapons. I mean, you can have the science there, but the technology is so massively expensive. Why would any government bother to do it, like the United States, if there was no reason to do it politically, militarily, existentially, and so on? And therefore, we wouldn't have any nuclear weapons today. There'd be no reason for it. What do you think about that kind of line of reasoning?
At one level, this is an old kind of really interesting question about history. So the great man theory, versus is it all just inevitable? Social forces. I've been listening to the Rest is History podcast, which is a great series of podcasts by Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. And last week I was listening to their series about Martin Luther, and a similar question comes up. It said, was the Reformation inevitable, or did it take this one guy who was really weird and very, really literally nailed his theses to the door to make it happen? And so when you look at the expense of the Manhattan Project, it is very difficult to see that happening without, but unless the government of the United States, had a metaphorical gun to its head. The sort of the classic story, which I think is in the Rhodes book, and you've probably heard, is that when they're building the separation plant at Oak Ridge, they need to make all these magnets, these electromagnets, which is going to require an absurd amount of copper to do the windings of all these magnets, and there's no way they can get it during the war. Someone comes up with the idea, well, silver is also a really good conductor of electricity, and there's tons of that just sitting in vaults, it's not being used for anything. And so they actually got permission from the Treasury Department to just melt down tons of silver and make it into wire and use it as magnet windings. So kind of an illustration of just the degree of trouble and expense that that the government was willing to go to. You never could have pushed that proposal through, during peacetime. So so I do think that, it probably doesn't happen absent some kind of hot war in which one side is convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the other side is actively developing this weapon. And we kind of have this today with countries like Iran. Are they doing it? How close are they? We know they're working on it. How close are they to actually building, a functional bomb? So, I think probably it would have happened at some point, maybe 50 years later, if there was a North Korea type rogue state and we started to develop the suspicion that that they were building one of these, then that might trigger the an effort for us to make one ourselves. But I definitely agree that the World War II was a really exceptional circumstance that led not only to the development of atomic bombs, but to the development of rockets. Like we wouldn't have had.
Right. So jet engines are kind of a natural extrapolation from propeller engines. But our rockets, that's a different category, I guess. What would be the reason for developing those? Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that.
Well, it's Hitler. He wants to bomb London.
Yeah, the V2, yeah.
He tries to make these wacky guns that can hit London from the Netherlands. He does the V1, the buzz bombs. But the really primo way to bomb London, if you're him, is with a rocket, and so it carries like 2,000 pounds of high explosive, and that might have been a dead end, except that device turns out to be a perfect way to lob a atomic bomb into a foreign country. So both the U.S. and the Soviets then in the 50s, starting from the V2 knowledge base, put trillions of dollars into advancing the state of rockets, just as vehicles for nuclear weapons.
Yeah, weapons delivery, because planes are too slow. Even the B-52, it only goes like 600 miles an hour. Nothing. You can easily shoot those down. Yeah, so let's think about innovation for a minute of all kinds. Here I'm leaning on Matt Ridley's book, Innovation, How Innovation Works. Nothing comes out of nothing. Everything has a predecessor and some kind of social cohesion where a lot of people are working at the same time. The light bulb, the telephone, the search engines. If it hadn't been Google, it would have been somebody else within a year or two that would have come up with something like a Google search engine. And as you said, the neutron is discovered in 32. Well, because there really actually is a neutron, somebody would have discovered it probably within a year or two. Okay, so there's that. But is the bomb different than that? And also, this I don't know. Could we have developed nuclear energy without the same science and technology that went into the making of the bomb?
I think you can get, I'm a little out of my depth here, but I would guess that you can get uranium to become hot with lower levels of enrichment. It's a little easier. You don't have to get the implosion device working. I think it's probably an easier lift than making a functional bomb that can actually be transported on a plane or a rocket. But I think you do have to do a lot of the same prerequisites in the way of mining and purifying and enriching the fissile material and that sort of thing.
Trying to remember where we are on the knowledge about Heisenberg and how close he was, and if he intentionally just didn't pursue it or they just went down the wrong path inadvertently.
Yeah, it's definitely been a topic of much discussion, right? So for those who don't know, a lot of the justification for the Manhattan Project was was people on our side looking nervously at Heisenberg and wondering, what he had at his disposal. He's in Germany, he obviously knows what everyone else knows about the theoretical possibility of making nuclear weapons. So are the Nazis, giving him his own Manhattan Project? Is he building a bomb? Well, if so, we'd better build one ourselves, and so, and then later, after the war, it turns out they were nowhere near being able to make their own bomb. So there's probably no way we could have really known that for sure, at the time. But yeah, then from there we get into these interesting questions that I don't know the answer to about, did he really know how to make the bomb, but he decided to kind of deliberately sort of drive that car into the ditch so that the Nazis wouldn't get one, or was he just wrong, or did he just not have the stuff, the resources that he needed? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody knows for sure. There was that play about that with Heisenberg and Bohr going to visit him to figure out how much he knew and what they were doing. Anyway, but I forget the details of that now. And then there's a history of science book around that.
Yeah, and there was a telegram that Bohr sent. My memory's getting a little hazy about this, but he sent some sort of coded telegram message to London in connection with those meetings that was interpreted to mean that the Germans, knew a lot, and that they'd better start, get their rear in gear, making a bomb. And then later on, when he was evacuated, when he got out, came into the West, it turned out that they had misinterpreted the telegram.
Yeah. Right. Then give us your thoughts on the ethics of using the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the Germans have surrendered. VE Day is over. Could we have beaten the Japanese without the bombs? Did it prevent hundreds of thousands of more American soldiers from dying with an invasion? Is it also a case of sunk costs? We've spent, all this money on the Manhattan Project. We might as well finish and then use it as a deterrence going forward to the Russians and so on and so forth.
I mean, I have a pretty mainstream view of this, which is that, you know, the as horrible as it is, the death toll from those bombs was not as high as just what was emerging from conventional firebombing. And if if that's what caused the surrender, then on balance, to the extent you can even make these horrible calculations, it was probably a good bargain both for Japan and for the United States. I mean, we tend to focus on how many Americans would have died invading those islands, but for every American who died, a bunch of Japanese defenders probably would have died as well from direct combat casualties or starvation or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Probably millions.
Yeah.
Because civilians would have done it too. I mean, if you look at Okinawa and Iwo Jima and even the civilian populations there, the Japanese military leaders were just willing to just sacrifice all those people. They just didn't care.
Yeah, I mean, and it's such an alien way of thinking to us that we tend not to believe it's real. But you kind of see the same thing now with how the Russians are waging the war in Ukraine. They're just perfectly fine, apparently, with just shoveling all of these conscripts, into the meat grinder there, and they don't seem to have any remorse about it or hesitation.
Yeah, I think Putin's an old school, like 19th century type political military leader. Just because no one really thought much about that back in those days. Things have changed since the Second World War for most people, but not everybody. Yeah. All right, give us your thoughts if you have any on solving what's called the Hobbesian trap or the security dilemma or the other guy problem. I would give up my nukes, but the other guy has them. And even if the other guy gives them, I don't really trust him when he says he's going to give up his nukes. So I better keep some on the side and so on. And we've just never been able to get around that.
Yeah, I mean, somehow we've gone all this time without nukes being used again, which is kind of the dog that didn't bark, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's kind of amazing when you think about it. So, I think kind of at the height of the Cold War, if you had gone to anybody in Moscow or Washington and said, well, in 2024, we'll still be living in a world where the only nukes ever used in anger were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we found a way to kind of make it work. The but it was a largely bipolar world, and so it's a little more complicated now with possible rogue states and multilateral considerations. The I'm really curious as to how many duds are sitting in the arsenals, because especially in the Russian arsenal, because keeping these things in operable condition is it's not like storing a cannonball, right? It's a very complicated object, and we can't test them. We can test components of them, and so make educated guesses. But I talked to somebody at Los Alamos who said that, imagine if you had to have a guarantee. You've got a car that's been completely disassembled and the parts are spread out on the floor, and you have to guarantee that if all of those parts are assembled and someone turns the key, the car will start the first time, 100%. It's a pretty tough problem. And I suspect a lot of the cars wouldn't start.
But you're not allowed to test it ahead of time before you
Right,
actually need it. Yeah.
right, right. So
Yeah.
there's elaborate systems for testing aspects of it, um, but you still don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I just had Annie Jacobson on the show for her new book, Nuclear War Scenario, where she kind of outlines what it would actually be like if one of these things happened. And yeah, it's pretty terrible. I mean, it's the kind of thing we really need to work on the problem. Um, but it's more of a political problem than a technological one. I mean, really, it's entirely that, or diplomatic, or something like that. Yeah, that's a good point about the possible duds, particularly in the Russian arsenal. Who knows? Although with Putin, he's probably spent some time or effort to make sure that there are some working. And little Rocket Man in North Korea, he actually tests them underground, so his probably actually do work. Whether he'd actually use them or not, it's probably more deterrence. But in any case, maybe we can continue on indefinitely. Sagan had calculated to prevent nuclear winter, it'd have to be less than 1,000 total nuclear detonated weapons. I think less than 900, something like that. And even now, it's like around 10,000, which is way down from about the 85,000 weapons there were, 70,000 weapons there were mid 80s. So, I don't know if we can keep going to get the number down below 900. But even that, imagine just wiping out 900 cities around the world. That's just massive. It's huge. It's unthinkable.
I hope so. Hope you're right.
Yeah. All right. All right. Let's hit some of the other big topics you've covered because you've hit all of the big ones on AI, ChatGPT, and all the deep fakes that we're seeing now. How much of this did you see? Were you surprised by some of the new developments? Where do you think it's going?
I was surprised. Yeah. Um, so that all that stuff kind of came out of nowhere. I think most people who weren't deeply embedded in these research projects were so, I don't know about you, but so taken aback when suddenly all these images started appearing. Um, I uh, think that um, I'm actually working on a Substack post about this now, but uh, it's one thing to look at them as demonstrations of what a powerful system can do. So I think a lot of those images are being put out as, hey, look at this powerful system we made. Look at what it can achieve. Um, when you look at it from the point of view of creative arts, if you're an artist or an appreciator of art, you look at this stuff. Uh, it's awful, right? It's very depressing to a lot of people who make their livings making art. It's not like they were having an easy time of it to begin with. A few successful people accepted. Most artists, are of the starving artist category, and it feels unfair. Feels like a bunch of billionaires beating up on the people who least deserve it in our society. But anyway, be that as it may, um, I I think the real impacts are going to be not in the creative sphere, but in all kinds of uh, commercial and industrial applications, which are harder to you, you can't just put up a cool picture on Twitter
Mm.
of an AI that reads spreadsheets really fast. It's just not visually compelling. So we don't see that, but that seems to be where the funding is going. If you look at what kinds of startups capitalists are investing in right now, it's not in making pictures. It's in the kind of the realm of kind of business and commercial applications.
Yeah. What about economically and financially and cryptocurrency and the whole Sam Bankman-Fried mess? Do you think that's going to set it back a while? Or do you think governments are going to clamp down on this?
I definitely set it back. I mean, the actually had a great. I did a podcast a few weeks ago with Tim Sweeney, CEO of Epic Games, and Matthew Ball, and Tim had a great take on the crypto industry, which is that there's all kinds of really interesting, fascinating possible uses for it, but that in some ways it's kind of its own worst enemy, in that keeps you keep getting these disappointing examples of disappointing behavior, that are
Yeah.
that are really widely publicized, and so that it tends to be a little self-reinforcing in a way, in that then the people who are most disappointed tend to avoid working in that area, and the people who are least disappointed sort of are drawn to it somehow. So, Tim, I think, kind of had the idea: could we just put a moratorium on it, just develop it in more of an abstract, way in a lab for 10 years, and then see what we've got. So, but I'm I'm a co-founder of Lamina One, which is a company that's got a new blockchain that has been optimized to support people who want to collaborate on creating an open metaverse. And we were able to bring that up in May, in spite of all kinds of headwinds, just from the crypto winter and the SBF thing and the Silicon Valley Bank thing, and so somehow that has survived, and we're continuing to push that forward, and we hope that we'll see some great results from it in the years to come.
Mm. Do you have any of your own personal money invested in the future versus just say putting it in the stock market?
In terms of personal investments, I tend to be pretty much a put it in the stock market or real estate kind of guy, because I don't to 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 competently invest money in specific companies really requires a lot of focus and attention, and you're in a sense kind of competing against bigger investors who have better information, right? So there are analysts across the lake from me who are just stationed in Redmond full time, who all they do is sit there and keep an ear to the ground about what's going on in Microsoft or you name it. But so there are people in these markets that just have information that individuals do not have access to. So it seems foolish to make such investments unless you've got personal information about the company that is hard to get. So I've put money into a startup that I'm a co-founder of called When Air, because I have I know what's going on there, and I feel confident about it. But I wouldn't go out and try to make smart bets on random tech companies.
Yeah, me neither. I'm reasonably cautious that way, although I probably have too much of my personal money and Skeptic's money in the Magnificent Seven, but they've done so well. These tech stocks.
Yeah, that's not a term I'm familiar with. Sorry.
Oh, the Magnificent Seven. This is Apple, Google, Intel, Microsoft, Facebook, NVIDIA. Anyway, so Yeah, they've just done spectacularly well. Okay, Ray
Sure.
Kurzweil's been making the rounds of his new book. The Singularity is Nearer, and now the latest is 2040. It's coming. What do you think about the singularity? Will it really change, or have we had a bunch of tiny little singularities along the way, and it's not going to be that big a deal? And if you want to speculate about mind uploading and all that kind of big stuff that Ray likes to talk about, please share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, I guess I'm more of a skeptic about singularity stuff. Uh, it seems like a big topic. I did use it as the premise for a fictional book because I thought it was could make for an interesting story. So, okay, let's say that there's something to this. Um, what would it look like in practice? What kind of story could I tell, around that idea? Uh, but of all the things I've written, I think Fall, which is that book, is kind of the most fanciful in a certain way. It's just like compared to Seven Eves, for example, there's no real um, research into the technologies being talked about. It's just, kind of a fairy tale uh, almost.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea that you could upload your connectome into the cloud. So you scan every single neuron and neural connection, synaptic connection in the brain. You could kind of do this now with frozen rabbit brains. They've done it with, and you take these little slices and you see the
Yep.
little dots for the synaptic connections and so on. But it seems to me there's a logical fallacy there, or maybe it's a metaphysical uh, problem that you are your point of view self from moment to moment continuously. You fall asleep, but you wake back up, or you get under anesthesia, but they bring you back. If you scan your brain and upload all your memories and whatever else is defining yourself into the cloud, that's just a snapshot of you at that particular moment. Your future self is now ended. It's somebody else. It's like having a twin who, the moment they step out and start leading their own lives, they're going down a slightly different pathway than you, and now that's a different person.
Yeah, I mean those are some of the questions I'm kind of playing with in Fall or Dodge and Hill. The story is that this guy's a wealthy tech bro who a couple decades ago signed up for this program to have his brain frozen and preserved when he died, and then he forgot about it. But the paperwork is still there, so when he does suddenly die, that all kicks in. His brain is preserved and scanned, and so he's kind of he's brought back to life in a sense in the cloud, and so I try to tackle a lot of the specific questions you're talking about, like, why is it that when we go to sleep and consciousness stops, but then we wake up, we're still the same person, or anesthesia, like you say. Like what's that about? What's going on there? And I think it's something to do with the story that our now brain is is sort of the tip of the spear of a story that propagates backward in time. And so um, um, we can, those memories are kind of what the ability to tell a story that leads to the here and now is kind of what makes us conscious humans. Um, and what happens in the book, which is completely made up, it's just like I said, a total fairy tale, is that uh, his memories are there, but they're all jangled up. They're the scanning process isn't perfect, and so it's kind of like everything he knows has been run through a log chipper, and he's kind of trying to reassemble it and make some sense of it in the digital afterlife. And he fastens on a few specific fragments of memory and kind of builds out from there. But it's not an exact correct memory. It's intermingled with uh, you know, fictional material and stuff that he's imagining, and old myths and religion and all of that.
Such good stuff. I love all that. There was a Star Trek Next Generation episode where Riker beams down to a planet and sees himself there because he had visited there like 15 years before, and the transporter had split him into two people, which he didn't know. And the original, the copy of the Riker who stayed on the planet and then led this whole other life. So, of course, it's not the same Riker because now he's had this whole other life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but I call this whole thing the afterlife for atheists because it's a kind of religion. We get to live
Yeah.
forever. And you listen to people like Ray Kurzweil. I mean, he's like a prophet, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're the first generation that's going to get to live forever. The person that's going to get to live forever is alive today. It's like, yeah, okay, really? Because this is what people have been saying for 10,000 years. We're the special chosen ones, and God's going to take us up into heaven and so on.
Well, that's why. I mean, I agree, and that's why that book, Fall, Dodge and Neal, is just as conceived as sort of a fable. Like, okay, let's just take that. Okay, if that's going to be a religion, let's just run with that and see where it can go in a narrative point of view. And I mean, spoiler alert, he ends up recapitulating a lot of old religious beliefs in a kind of mixed up way.
Yeah. Yeah. And Seven Eves, you also, as another topic here, project 5,000 years into the future. There'll be multiple, hominid species living at the same time, like there once was, a couple 100,000 years ago. There were a dozen different bipedal primates running around the world. Now there's just us. And we did interbreed with Neanderthals and the Denisovans, it appears, probably others as well. There's probably a lot of interbreeding going on there. But the moment you separate populations and they're reproductively isolated, by definition, that's a new species. So colonizing Mars and maybe the planets around, or the moons around Jupiter and Saturn and so on, that's going to create new human species. Then what?
Yeah, I mean, it's a staple of fantasy and science fiction that to have this, right? So in fantasy, you've got elves, dwarves, hobbits, and in Star Trek, you've got Vulcans and Klingons and Romulans, and somehow they're all, like you say, bipedal hominids. They can all communicate. They can even interbreed somehow. Yeah, somehow Spock's mom is a human with hemoglobin in her veins, and Spock's dad is a Vulcan with green blood, but somehow they can
Yeah.
get it on and have a kid. So I was just really interested in that as a writer. Like, why do fans of fantasy and science fiction just dig that theme so much? Because I do. I'm not like peering at this from the outside. I'm totally a fan of all these IPs. And it's a given in all of these cases that these different races, or whatever you call them, have got fixed behavioral traits. So the dwarves are kind of surly and they make things, and the elves are ethereal and fancy, and the Vulcans are logical, and the Bajorans are emotional. So
Yeah.
so I mean, it's all stuff that on the face of it is the very definition of racist.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it just is, but it's okay in the context of fandom to enjoy that, and it's not seen as being. I mean, there's some people from a more kind of woke sort of critical theory background who are looking at this like, hang on a sec, what are we really saying here? But millions of fans don't care. Even fans who would probably, belong to the kind of the progressive end of the spectrum. So, um, so I just thought, with Seven Eves, so well, okay, if this is what people like, let's do one of those. But well, there'll actually be a story or a reason for where these different species arose from, and why they're different and how they're different. Um, so uh, so we don't have these ridiculous complications like Vulcans and humans having kids together. There's all. So that was one of uh, the basic motivations for trying to write that book. And the idea was always to end up in a distant future that, like the future of Star Trek or Star Wars, is populated by these different species, but it actually makes sense. And there's actually there's everyone knows where all of these species came from.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I first read the stories about all of us have 2% Neanderthal blood in us. That I call that the Stephen Stills theory of evolution. That is, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with.
Yeah, that's good.
Those cold
Yeah.
European winter nights.
And in Seven Eves, we get some synthetic they're called neolanders. There's a deliberate effort to sort of resuscitate the Neanderthal DNA, and so those people are characters in the book.
Yeah, but even more interesting to me, I think, would be thinking about political and economic systems. Like when we colonize Mars, what kind of political system are they going to have? What kind of money, or maybe they'll use crypto or whatever. And but just carry that out 5,000 years. Will they have something like religion? Will they end up with something like democracy? Will they have a currency-based economy and with a regulated capitalist free market, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think a lot of religious behavior keeps recapitulating itself. That there's in progressive politics, there's clear echoes of sort of Puritanism,
Mm-hmm.
um, and um, and you can see that pattern. It's just a pattern that emerges in human behavior over and over again, regardless of whether you literally believe in God or not. So that kind of recapitulation just seems to happen over and over again. Regardless of whether it makes sense or whether we think it's a good idea. And so I don't know. But until something happens to change that, I think it's best to expect it, and to have some way of of uh, of dealing with it when it emerges.
Yeah, I remember asking Neal on Twitter, and you actually responded. What kind of political system are you going to have, like a republic or something? He said direct democracy. No more extra rules and people representing other people. It's just everybody gets a vote. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem of the tyranny of the majority that the founding fathers dealt with.
Yeah, it's a bad idea. There's a American philosopher named Charles Saunders Peirce, Pearce, who in the 1870s wrote a great piece of work about where people get beliefs from. And he, make a long story short, he ends up deciding that the best way to approach this is what he calls fallibilism, which is simply assume that you might be wrong. Maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time. And so kind of any approach to belief and life that where you're certain you're right is probably a bad way to go. Uh, and what that tends to, if you try to put that into practice, it tends to lead to a sort of conservative, middle of the road approach to politics. Like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So uh, you know, uh, try to preserve institutions over time that have worked in the past, that have led to stable democracies in the past. Don't try to over innovate. So he's worth checking out. If I'm a big fan of his system.
Yeah, fallibilism is the basis of Bayesian reasoning. I always like Cromwell's rule in Bayesian reasoning after Oliver Cromwell's line. What is it? I think in the bowels of Christ you might be mistaken. Yeah, because we probably are about a lot of things. So assume that you're probably wrong and then go from there. Yeah. So, well, but what I'm getting at there is, are these assuming far future humans or aliens we encounter, they'll still understand physics in the way we understand physics and mathematics and so on, because those things are real. They're really there.
Yeah.
They'll discover the neutron of the atom like we did, because there really is a neutron of the atom. But is democracy and market economies, are those in that same category? I mean, they're discoverable as systems that really work, or are they human inventions and be more like art?
I think there's a lot of path dependency. If you look at the unwritten British Constitution,
Hmm.
I mean, that's just there's no one who sat down and came up with that. You can sort of copy it. You say, okay, well, we're going to create a parliamentary democracy. It's going to have these features, but it's not it's not codified, and it depends for its stability on a lot of institutions that are completely irregular. Just no. Uh, there's all these weird job titles and uh, uh, functions that play important roles in that system that you never would have created just from a blank sheet of paper. So and again, I mean, this the Rest is History podcast has some good stuff about this, but you can kind of look at the English, French, uh, and American systems, and the Americans they are trying to sort of, in a very Enlightenment way, the they're trying to scrape off all of the weird encrustations and rights of the British system, so create something from first principles that's sufficiently well designed, to be stable for a long time. And they did a reasonably good job of that. And then the French are more in the French Revolution a few years later. They end up with something that they're trying to do a similar thing, but it ends up being less stable and long lived for whatever reason. So I don't know, the things that grow up organically over time seem to be capable of stability, but you can't always wait 2,000 years for that system to grow up.
Yeah. Well, this was Edmund Burke's point in criticizing the French Revolution but supporting the American Revolution, was because if you tear down all those institutions that have been around for centuries, there's a reason they're there. They work pretty well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So um so I don't know, I was around a year ago in London for the inauguration of the 695th Lord Mayor, the Right Honorable the Lord Mayor of
Okay.
the City of London, and that's a whole that's a whole crazy
I
sort
don't
of
know anything about that.
Harry Potter, Monty Python kind of universe, but it goes back to Rome, basically, you know. And in the Magna Carta, so 1215, there's a line somewhere in there that says, well, you know, the city of London is kind of its own thing, and it'll have the same privileges it has had since time immemorial. You know, so
yeah. All right, Neal,
so I guess yeah, don't go tearing things down that actually seem to be working. I guess seems to be the
well,
story.
we have some of that now. That, you know, just the volatility of the current events. You know, people just want to tear it all down and start over. This is a terrible idea.
Yeah. Fallibilism is the way.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Last topic here. You in Anathema, you wrote about Platonic realism and nominalism and all that stuff. Another one of my favorite topics. You know, are the laws of nature out there to be discovered? To what extent do we create them as descriptions of things, but there aren't really laws? How do you think about that?
I mean, I'm fine with Platonism. You know, the idea that you know, 3 is a prime number and has always been a prime number and will always be a prime number and would be a prime number even if humans weren't around to think about it as such. So the analogy that some of the people use in the book, which is based on real biology, has to do with locusts. Or cicadas, they come out of the ground at different intervals in numbers of years. There's like 13-year locusts and 17-year locusts. Tends to be a prime number because the whole strategy is predator satiation. So it's really hard for a predator to sync up its reproductive cycle with the 13-year. You know, they have to actually hit that number. They can't, you know, hit some divisor of that number. So in a way, nature and evolution have discovered the concept of primeness without any humans around to have thought of it. So that's kind of my clincher, I guess, for the Platonic.
I think that's right. Yeah. Although maybe that was you or somebody else who criticized Sagan's contact theme of the prime numbers being beamed in, and that could only be an artificial intelligent signal in the noise. But there are prime number sequences that are natural. And I think there's even Fibonacci numbers that certain plants use.
Yeah. It wasn't me, by the way, but
okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Neal, this is all super interesting. I could talk to you for hours about all this stuff. We didn't even really get into aliens. That's a whole nother topic of our of preference here. All right, here it is again, Polostan.
Okay,
we'll release this the week this podcast comes out. The book comes out.
Great. Okay, much appreciated.